Dennis was very determined. In fact, I think his buildings are as great as they are because of his own astonishing stubbornness and determination.
Laston had a strong sense that architecture, to be good, required to be very specific. So you were building for the specific institution on the specific site. So you're not just finding a solution to the college, you're finding the solution to Fitzwilliam House. It wasn't yet a college, it was the buildings were here in order to make it a college.
Gradually the idea came together of the hall being a kind of centrepiece round which a snail was formed.
The spiral of Laston's original master plan enabled every single room to look directly to the central chapel and hall in the way that only rooms in the privileged first court do in older college buildings. Laston's solution at Fitzwilliam was to think about the hierarchy of older Cambridge colleges and to deliberately avoid it. So the original senior common room was much more exposed than was traditionally the case.
Which, because the 50s were passionately democratic times, was all glass so that the senior fellows and others would be visible to the undergraduates at all times. Iceland belonged to the tough group of modern architects that had James Stirling in it too, for example. And they didn't want to use bricks that had variations of earth colour because it was too arts and crafts for their liking. Iceland used black brick so that you were actually declaring the colour of the material rather than its earthiness. He made vertical windows, a wide one and a narrow one, and to run those windows right along the facade, the intervals between the windows are only repeated after you had about 12 rooms, I think. It was a very suitable task for a boy like me. It doesn't look at all repetitive. It's just got all along these different intervals.
The controversial thing about the roof is the frill around the edge, which isn't structurally necessary and doesn't express the structure behind it. This is not very like Laston. Generally, his most dramatic forms come out of how the building is built and are expressive of the technology and the engineering. This is a very odd departure from that.
I think the hall is a fantastic space. Just that triumphant composition in section. We've got the open ground level, and then the really solid concrete middle, and then the exuberant lantern. It looks like a fortified building. It's trying to express that this is the centre of the college. This is where the social function exists. We were originally daunted at the prospect of trying to engage with a building that had pretty much been left as it was originally designed, and it stood the test of time pretty well, apart from a few cracks in the concrete. So how would you approach this building to breathe new life into it without taking away all those aspects that are important and intrinsic to it?
Laston's original plan was to make a big court, and so New Court was part of that ambition, really, to keep going and to make one big court. The entrances to each stair arrangement go underneath the kitchen. That internal arrangement, which is intended to be a kind of contribution to the liveliness of student community, does precipitate an elevational idea where each floor is different to the floor below. The idea of the stepped section is that every student room has got its own little sitting space that is outside the building. In Gothic architecture, the saints sit in the edifices at the west front. These little houses are representing the fact that every room has a student who can appear in his or her edicule. The circular building was prompted by the feeling that if you're putting something on the end of the Lasdun terrace, you've got to produce a kind of image that is absolutely distinct and is a termination. But then in the history of church architecture, there was always a tension between whether ecclesiastical buildings ought to be linear or whether they should be centralized. So what I did was to continue the linear character of the Lasdun building inside the chapel so that it's got a sort of implied nave, and the square structure then has two arcs of a circle around it so that the linear form and the circular form are reconciled by the square, and then that misfit, if you like, produces the effect of light falling outside the central square. The tree is exactly on axis, which is an extraordinary bit of luck. Nave, of course, is the Latin for ship. An influence on me was going to Scandinavia and seeing the Museum of Viking Longships in Oslo. Wood is the material of furniture, and it seems to me that furniture is much closer to us than buildings are. So to make the congregational vessel into a wooden ship is a kind of psychological move to make the most important part of the building mediate between the building as a masonry structure and human beings with their hands and so on. In another sense, it's a building made of wood inside another building. Designing the relationship between the ship, if you like, the wooden vessel, and the building itself is one of the most difficult things that I've ever done.
When we first saw the site, the first thing we thought in a way was what an opportunity for our building to be the building that opened the site up, because the southeast corner was all fenced off. The reaction to the Lasdun buildings was not, in a way, an innocent reaction, because we knew them so well. We knew that what we'd do wouldn't look exactly like them, but it was always our intention that our building should be a sort of reflection and development on what was there already, and indeed New Court as well. Perimeter buildings as the residential, and then different function buildings as pieces of furniture in a room contained by those edge buildings. And that was the inspiration for our idea of making the main part of the building as this 3-story building on a corner, and then separating out the lecture theatre building, little 2-story building, as a rather sort of enigmatic, special building. It was quite a complex brief to fit onto what actually was a very tight site. And in fact, that need to be very compact led to some of the design solutions. For example, on the western side, the building moves out over the ground floor to accommodate the tree roots.
It provided the college with a kickstart to its conference business, because it gave us our first raked auditorium, only 60 seats, 57 I think. That is a very successful, intimate space, and I think it's fair to say that the interiors of Wilson Court are highly successful. They're very durable, they're very attractive, and with the concept of 2 linked staircases solved, difficult things like fire exits.
I must say that it was very refreshing working for Fitz because of the huge pride that it had in what it had done so far. and not just in its buildings but in its grounds, that was very inspirational to us. And one wanted to match that and do something that they deserved.
There was a coherent set of buildings that had clearly been designed carefully in response to each other, and we were having to complete. But then on the other hand, unlike those other projects, we were making a public front to the college and making it into what is essentially a residential street. So we held the building back a little bit, so the space helped to give it presence. And very soon a conversation began really about whether there should be some kind of taller element within the facade, which you'd see from much further away. So that's really how the lantern came about as an element which would sort of rise out of the horizontal form of the body of the building.
I think one of its most successful features is the way that, unlike traditional colleges with oak gates keeping everybody out, Fitzwilliam has a glazed entrance that brings people in, and you can actually see in and enjoy the place from the outside in a way that historic colleges can't.
We realised quite quickly that by the time you'd had the space for the auditorium itself with raked seating and the sort of volume you need above that for the acoustic performance of the space, that we were talking again about a 3-storey building. In other words, a building the same height or higher probably than the residential buildings, and that just didn't seem right to us. So we looked at the possibility then of dropping the building by a storey into the ground. We could then put windows into the building at ground floor level. You would then be able to effectively look through the building. You could see right the way through from one side to another and out into the landscape beyond. It meant that when you arrived into the auditorium, you would arrive at the top of the seating.
It was essential, in my judgment, to have retractable seating if you were going to make it a multi-purpose building, and the college very much wanted that. Although the auditorium maximum capacity is 250, the retractable seating is only 140. That flexibility is a great success.
There's quite a big change in the building as you move from the solidity really of the auditorium into the foyer space. Suddenly it becomes completely glass. And really your experience then is nothing to do with the building, really. It is entirely to do with the space that's created by the trees. The fellows of a college take very seriously their responsibilities for their buildings in the long term. And that does mean in the end the materials you use should be chosen with that in mind, that they're materials which you expect to be able to last.
The big issue for the fellowship with the library was, would you still be able to see the grove when you entered through the old Porter's Lodge? And that was absolutely crucial, and indeed, as we now know, the building enhances the grove rather than the reverse.
The grove sits within the college grounds with a different geometry to all the other buildings. It was there first, it has a right to do that, but it's tilted at a curious angle to Lasden's framework. And our new building here, the library, what it tried to do was to create a space in front of the grove at the same time as reconciling the geometry of the Lasden range.
We made the staircase for the library, or the visible staircase for the library, into a tower to make a termination to Lasden's rooms in a vigorous way. The stair is enlarged so that it has reading places all the way up it. And also that staircase goes on up to the roof, to a little nest at the top, which you can see the university library from.
When you get to the top of the tower, you're looking out not just at Cambridge, but the rest of the college grounds. It's a treat to walk up the tower, sit and read in contemplate those views which didn't exist beforehand. We take the starting point of putting reader spaces on the outside of the building where the best light is, and you push the books and everything else to the centre of the building where you can protect them from the daylight. We have the job of designing these things. The contractors then have the job of building it, and we really shouldn't underestimate the ingenuity that goes into that. It was a very complicated build which they achieved on time, on budget.
It was hugely successful, I think, the library, because the working relationships were amongst the very best that I've ever experienced on any building project. Fitz is very welcoming as an institution anyway, and I think encouraging the contractors to be part of the life of the college for the duration of the work pays off in spades.
It feels so delightfully mature now, and that tradition at Fitzwilliam, better than any other college, to do with landscape and making the outdoor really as important as the indoor. I'm so delighted to come back and see that in its full maturity.
The character of a place is a very subtle thing, and it would have been incredibly easy to have lost the particular identity of Fitzwilliam as other new buildings were added. But each of the architects, as they've arrived, have tried very hard to develop a new architecture and new buildings out of the kind of language which Lasdun established at the beginning.
Over 50 years of repeated development, it's done this, it's maintained the spirit of the thing while allowing different imaginations to bring their contributions to it. And the result is very understandable. You can walk in and know where you are straight away and what to do. Fitzwilliam is a series of variables that add up to a whole. So it's a little beyond making a series of chords, and it's very graceful and very calm as a result of it.